How has Ukraine, a smaller country, managed to rise and humiliate Putin's war machine? 2.5 years in, Ukraine's resilience is undeniable, while Russia's military stumbles and Putin's grand plans unravel. What's behind Ukraine's unexpected strength, and how is it turning the tide against one of the world's biggest military powers? In this video, we'll explore the real reasons that Ukraine is not just surviving but thriving, and why Putin's Russia is crumbling under its own weight. A big part of Ukrainian optimism can be attributed to the enormous amounts of financial and military support that other countries have provided so far. While public support across much of the world is pretty overwhelmingly in Ukraine's favor, the actual benefactors so far have been the NATO member states. Combined, they've provided roughly 99% of all financial and military aid. According to the Kiel Institute, total financial and military aid to Ukraine has amounted to roughly 185 billion euros, roughly $204 billion, with the US being the biggest provider overall. Additionally, Kiel estimates that there is a further 100 billion euros in aid that has not yet been allocated as of June 30, 2024. Of course, these numbers are not fully up to date, and there are some inconsistencies in the way Kiel's tracking aligns with that of various governments. But the overall figures suggest that Ukraine is on track to receive more than $300 billion worth of financial and military aid by the end of 2024. Part of this aid has been in the form of direct financial support to help the country recover as its economy became fully war-centric. According to some estimates, Ukraine is spending roughly 40% of its GDP and 60% of its total revenue on military and national defense, figures that are practically unheard of in modern countries. For reference, the US spends about 3.4% on its military, and Russia's 2024 budget suggests that it's spending around 7% of GDP and 40% of the total government budget on its military. But the bigger, or rather more important component of aid to Ukraine has been the wide range of military equipment and ammunition that's been donated by the US and other NATO countries. These weapons are what have been keeping the country afloat and repelling the Russian invasion to date. Most notably, it's the defensive weapons, tanks, and infantry support vehicles that have made the biggest impact for Ukraine so far. We'll cover them all briefly to give you an idea of why they are important and how they stack up against their Russian counterparts. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has long been adamant about the pressing need for Ukraine to receive F-16s in order to start turning the tide of the war, and for a good reason. The F-16 is pretty much on par with some of Russia's most modern fighter and multi-purpose combat jets, such as the Sukhoi Su-35 and MiG-29, and their ability to incorporate various types of both air-to-air and air-to-ground missiles could make a massive impact on the war. Ukraine's ability to field a fleet of relatively modern fighter jets would allow them to push back on Russia's ability to launch strikes from afar and control the flow of the invasion. Both Russia and Ukraine have robust defensive capabilities in place to deal with the other side's missiles and drone strikes. However, for the first 2 years of the war, Russia has had an overwhelming advantage due to actually being able to use their airplanes over the Ukrainian sky without much retaliation from Ukrainian air forces. By Ukraine's estimate, the country needs roughly 128 F-16s in order to field a fleet comparable to Russia's and to start using their jets on more effective offensive missions. The current allotment of 65 F-16s from various European countries, only signed off by the US at the end of 2023, is a great start to reclaiming Ukrainian airspace sovereignty. Additionally, the F-16s that are being delivered aren't exactly standard by any measure. Footage and reports from the field show that while the donated F-16s are relatively old and were in the process of being mothballed by their native countries, they have been retrofitted with more advanced early warning systems to detect incoming missiles. These upgraded EW systems, plus a few other choice upgrades to the radar and electronic warfare systems, push the Ukrainian F-16s firmly into the modern age of warfare, arguably making them more useful than Russia is currently capable of fielding. This all goes to show why the sight of F-16s making their first flights over the Ukrainian sky in August 2024 was such a pivotal moment in Ukraine's pushback against Russia's offensive. The F-16s have become yet another layer in the country's already resilient anti-air defenses. However, the US has issued a caveat to the deployment of these jets. Ukraine can't use them for offensive operations on Russian soil, at least for now. But that might be changing, and quite soon, due to something else that Ukraine has done, which we'll cover a bit later. Before we get there, let's take a look at the differences between NATO-provided tanks and those that Russia and Ukraine have been working with so far. Both sides have relied heavily on Soviet-era tanks, in particular the famous T-type tanks, such as the T-72. Russia is one of the few countries that retain the capacity to produce T-type tanks, while Ukraine inherited a part of the Soviet arsenal when the Union dissolved in 1991. Russia has also upgraded the T-line, culminating in the T-90 and the T-90M tanks, along with the apparent failure that is the next-generation T-14 Armata. As a result, the Russian army has been using T-90s, T-82s and T-72s as the main battle tanks driving their offensives forward through the Ukrainian landscape. On the other hand, NATO has provided Ukraine with additional T-72s, since the Ukrainian army has the most knowledge and experience working with these models, along with US-made M1 Abrams, German-made Leopards, and UK-made Challenger 22s. What all the NATO-made tanks have in common is that they need one more crew member than the T-72, while also being heavier and more durable than Russia's T-90s. The specific armaments for each tank differ slightly, with the Challengers needing UK-specific ammo to function, making the UK basically the only country that can supply it. On the other hand, Leopard 2s are widespread throughout Europe and have been donated by various countries, with Poland, Germany and Spain some of the biggest contributors. The M1 Abrams is the flagship US main battle tank, used to great effect by the US Army since the late 80s. But perhaps more importantly, what all these tanks have in common is that they don't suffer from the same fatal flaw that the T-tanks fielded by Russia all share. The T-90 and its earlier versions all have an autoloader system that stores spare ammunition in a separate container below the main turret. While this allows the tanks to fire comparatively faster relative to their Western counterparts, the ammo stockpile itself is shielded by a relatively thin piece of armor. Although it may be sufficient to protect against traditional gunfire and even tank rounds, anti-tank mines and kamikaze drones can puncture this armor from directly below or above the tank. If that happens, the ordnance's detonation can set fire to the ammunition in the tank, resulting in what can be described as an explosive decapitation that destroys the entire tank. Considering that Ukraine has also been one of the main playgrounds for modern drone warfare, this has been a serious problem for Russian ground forces. These are not the large drones like the famous US-made Predator B, officially the General Atomics MQ-9 Reaper, which costs $32 million each and can be used for both recon and seek and destroy missions. Ukraine has been shifting to using commercial drones, retrofitted with anti-tank mines or bombs that can be remotely set off when needed. It's these drones that can effortlessly track down and destroy T-type tanks, and the number of tanks that Russia has lost as a result is estimated to be a staggering 8,900, more than the US military fields in total. The other class of land vehicle that's performed admirably in Ukrainian hands is infantry support vehicles. In particular, the reigning champions of NATO donations in this category have been the M2 Bradleys provided by the US. The Bradleys have more robust protection than their Russian equivalents, the BMP line. A Bradley's armor stops 30mm ammo around the whole vehicle, while Russia's BMP-3 is only protected against those rounds in the front. The older BMP-2, Russia's main infantry fighting vehicle in the war, can only withstand 23mm rounds on its frontal arc. Furthermore, the Bradley has more advanced optic systems, including the SADA-2 thermal sight that is also used in M1 Abrams tanks. Baseline BMPs are not equipped with thermal sights, making them relatively useless in low-visibility environments by comparison. Finally, the Bradley's main armament, the M242 autocannon, can fire independently and accurately while the vehicle is on the move, giving the Ukrainian army superior mobility and strategic advantages. For example, 2 Bradleys were able to dispatch a Russian tank using autocannons alone. Alternatively, a Bradley can also carry an anti-tank mortar, with one such vehicle destroying 2 Russian tanks all by itself. While the tanks and infantry support vehicles have been vital to Ukraine in fending off offensives such as the aforementioned summer offensive in Kharkiv, Russian long-range artillery fire has been one of the main reasons Ukraine hasn't been able to make a significant push to free its occupied territory. NATO has provided plenty of artillery support, including the HIMARS system with a range of roughly 50 miles and the ATACMS mid-range missile that can reach 180 miles. However, Russia has enjoyed an overwhelming numerical advantage. Additionally, the Russian Iskander SS-26 missile has a maximum range of 300 miles, outranging Ukraine's artillery by some distance. Moreover, Russia has upgraded its Soviet-era howitzer artillery, such as the Tu-S3, with the more recent models, such as the Tu-S19, capable of achieving sustained fire over 7 rounds per minute and even up to 10 rounds per minute. Russia makes 3 million artillery rounds per year, compared to NATO only delivering 1.2 million a year. This has enabled Russia to leverage its howitzers to create mid-range walls that Ukraine wasn't able to plow through. Or rather, it wouldn't have been able to if Russia hadn't been using its howitzers purely for offense and not for defense too. While Russia was busy utilizing howitzers to push into Ukraine's east agonizingly slowly, largely thanks to NATO-donated land vehicles and defenses, Ukraine had another brilliant idea. It pushed into Russia. On August 6, 2024, a small contingent of Ukrainian soldiers and supporting vehicles crossed into the Russian region of Kursk, which is on the northeastern part of the border between the two countries. Initial reports could only be found from the Kremlin, which quickly announced that the invading force would be dealt with, labeling Ukrainians as terrorists in a long-standing attempt to justify its special military operation. After a few days, it became clear that Russia hadn't set up a proper response to the incursion in Kursk. Instead, they left poorly equipped local defenses to deal with the approaching Ukrainians. What followed was a wave of Russian soldiers surrendering their posts. According to the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense, the 3-week-long invasion led to the capture of close to 600 Russian soldiers. A report from a prison processing the prisoners of war suggested that up to 80% of the defensive forces inside Russia consisted of relatively fresh conscripts. An interview with one of the POWs suggested that the conscript had as little as a week or two of basic combat training before being sent to the border with Ukraine. It should be noted that while Russia does have mandatory conscription, and it's using it to replenish its ranks at a rate of roughly 300,000 conscripts per year, the conscripts are legally not allowed to be deployed abroad. That left the poorly trained soldiers to defend various Russian regions bordering Ukraine, seemingly in the hope that Ukrainian intelligence wouldn't figure it out. But Ukraine did, and took full advantage of this oversight on Russia's part. The invasion of the Kursk region turned into a resounding success for Ukraine, which seized roughly 500 square miles of territory, displacing between 120,000 and 200,000 Russians as a result. When compared to the Russian advances of 2024, Ukraine managed to occupy as much land in 3 weeks as Russia had in the past 7 months. This demonstrates the lack of effectiveness in the Russian army, even when Ukraine was only partially outfitted with NATO weapons. The invasion in Kursk opened the door for Ukraine to seize more territory and make more aggressive moves in several ways. Firstly, the artillery support that Ukraine brought along enabled it to bombard the vital bridges and supply lines that Russia could use to reinforce Kursk. This would theoretically allow Ukraine to take more Russian territory whenever it saw fit. Russia's only recourse would be to remove some of its long-range capacity from the Eastern Front and point it at Kursk. This would give Ukraine more breathing room to defend Donbass, one of the main goals of the Kursk invasion. Zelensky said that Ukraine planned to control Kursk for as long as possible, presenting a clear signal to Russia that Ukraine is fully capable of putting offensive pressure on Russian territory while holding onto its own. Additionally, the neighboring region of Belgorod was a target of a similar, albeit unsuccessful incursion in 2023, and Ukraine ramped up its attacks on that region throughout August of this year as well. This escalation is likely in line with the same diversionary tactics that Ukraine is using to try and force the Kremlin to ease up on aggressive operations on the Eastern Front. But the invasion of Kursk opened up another can of worms for Russia by crossing one of Russia's so-called red lines for using nuclear weapons. Over the course of the war, Russia has frequently pointed to various events that would be sufficient cause for it to use nuclear weapons on Ukraine or NATO members in response. Most of these red lines have been related to proposed NATO donations to Ukraine. For example, the delivery of F-16s was only approved in late 2023 due to NATO's hesitation to cross Russia's red line objections to their possible use in targeting Russian military compounds. The red line supposedly crossed in Kursk was the use of NATO donations to facilitate Ukraine's invasion of Russian territory. However, the invasion largely happened independently of NATO donations, and NATO intelligence claims to have had no knowledge of Ukraine's invasion plans until the day of the invasion itself. The lack of a nuclear response to the invasion showed that Russia was impotently threatening the West for helping Ukraine, at least in terms of Ukraine's actions thus far. This has only served to embolden Ukraine, culminating in the first ever large-scale drone attack on the Russian capital Moscow in late August. The attack showed that Ukraine has sufficiently built up its offensive capabilities to threaten Russia, and not just in the industrial and rural parts of Russia, but Moscow itself, which has been largely unaffected by the war so far. This leads us to another way in which Ukraine is trying to disrupt Russia's war effort by lowering morale and diminishing the effect of Russian propaganda. Throughout the war in Ukraine, Russia has been using cyber warfare to sow discord among the West and to push the idea that Russia's special military operation in Ukraine is justified to its own citizens. One of the main reasons why the propaganda has worked is that the main population centers such as Moscow or St. Petersburg haven't been affected to a life-changing extent by the war. Russian conscription and military recruitment efforts have nearly universally targeted either the poorer regions of Russia or Russian convicts. The draw for the poorer regions has been quite simple: money. The Russian military has been offering salaries between 3 and 4 times higher than the national average to attract contract soldiers. A report by PBS suggests that ethnic minorities have been disproportionately represented in Russian death tolls compared to the country's overall demographics, with one report stating that 6 of the 10 regions with the largest number of casualties are in Siberia. By demonstrating that Ukrainian drones and missiles can actually reach the Russian seat of power, Zelensky has sent a message that Moscow residents are not safe from the war, and since that will inevitably be felt by ordinary Russians and within Western nations, the hope is that Kremlin propaganda could evaporate conflict in practically an instant. But even if Putin doesn't actually rely on buy-in from the Russian population to stay in power, Ukraine has another trick up its sleeve. It can attack the oligarchs upon whom he definitely does rely. The economic sanctions put in place by the West when Russia first invaded had a staggering effect on Russia's economy, particularly on its international trade. Russia has relied on its oil and gas exports to fuel its economy for decades, which has allowed owners of energy companies to rake in billions in profit. When the sanctions hit, Europe pretty much cut off its oil trade with Russia. Countries such as China and India stepped up to soften the blow, allowing Russia to recoup its losses and even bounce back economically, at a time when the rest of the world was just starting to recover from the COVID pandemic just a year earlier. In 2023, bilateral trade between China and Russia hit an all-time high of $240 billion. But the Russian oil and gas supply model is one of on-demand exporting, where the oil refineries are essentially pumping out products for both export and internal consumption. As such, Russia doesn't actually have a significant stockpile of export-ready oil. Ukraine has capitalized on this oversight by launching drone attacks against oil refineries in the Russian southwest, near the Ukrainian border. Why are these refineries located there when the bulk of the oil is in Siberia? Before the sanctions started, the EU had been the main importer of Russian oil and gas, so refineries were set up near Russia's European borders to provide more efficient and cost-effective supply to EU markets. But now what was once Russia's advantage has turned into its potential downfall. As a result of widespread internal deficits due to Ukraine striking down its oil refineries, Russia has banned gasoline and diesel exports to most countries that weren't part of the Soviet Union. While this might cause the volume of Russian crude oil exports to rise in the short term, it will also increase Russia's reliance on China and India as its main customers. This presents a problem for the Russian oligarchs, who are making fortunes from Russia's exports to Europe, as much of their influence derived from their connections in the West. Since the East now holds the reins of Russia's economy, Putin has started targeting oligarchs with the aim of nationalizing many private companies in the energy sector. This means that the network that has supported Putin's rise to power has started to unravel, and Putin and the oligarchs could be scrambling to take each other out before either one or the other becomes obsolete. This has caused Russia to become increasingly isolationist on the geopolitical stage, to the point that it started recreating Cold War-era practices. These might have worked when the Soviet Union's economy was on par with the US's, but now Russia barely manages to make it onto the top 10 economies. What's more, Russia's biggest trading partner is China, the world's second biggest economy. As a result of sanctions, China's products are starting to monopolize the Russian market, and if this trend continues, Russia might have to face its local manufacturing industries being replaced completely by China, making it even more dependent on China's vast market and geopolitical influence. As we previously mentioned, Russia's local economy has become increasingly dependent on exports, with more and more money being funneled into national defense. These discrepancies are pushing the country's elite out of the equation. In the first year of the war, roughly 900,000 Russians left the country, mostly people with lucrative jobs in the upper brackets of earnings. Losing most of its able and educated manpower will eventually cause Russia to become even more dependent on trade and more vulnerable as a result. If China decides that it no longer needs Russia's oil, for example if it completes the Belt and Road Initiative that aims to definitively connect it to Saudi Arabia, the Russian economy might just disintegrate. On the other hand, Ukraine has become a beacon for democracy and Western support. After the resounding success of the Kursk invasion, the US announced yet another round of financial and military aid, this time including a new Patriot missile anti-air system. This addition will make Ukraine even more resilient to Russian attacks, and together with the new F-16s flying over Ukraine, help it carve a direct path into Russian airspace. Additionally, NATO military chiefs have sided against the administration in the US by supporting Ukrainian efforts to use the donated weapons to perform long-range strikes into Russian territory. While Ukraine has been partially successful with deep strikes conducted solely via drone warfare, the use of more advanced and deadly systems such as ATACMS missiles poses another threat to Russia's ability to supply its economy with the oil it needs and its front lines with more soldiers and military equipment. And this support by NATO for Ukraine to go on the offensive is what might ultimately push the war to an end. Since one of Putin's red lines has already been crossed, NATO weapons facing Russia, even if operated by Ukraine, present a level of threat that Russia has yet to face throughout the previous 30 months of war. Considering how ineffective previous saber-rattling initiatives by the Kremlin have been in stopping the flow of NATO firepower, Putin is running out of options and fast. One of the responses from the Russian president has been to implement an amendment to Russia's nuclear defense policy, further justifying the use of nuclear weapons against Ukraine and NATO should the US provide more offensive weapons. This threatened escalation is something that NATO has to take into account and consider seriously whether Putin would actually pull the trigger if it comes to that. These shifting Russian red lines are further evidence of the country's failing geopolitical pressure on the US. Zelensky has already proposed a so-called victory plan to Biden, although the latter wasn't particularly thrilled with it. So both countries seem to have different ideas as to how the war might pan out in the months and years ahead. However, Russia keeps moving its goalposts to be more on the defensive, while Ukraine keeps pushing for more offense. And public opinion across Europe shows support for either Ukraine winning the war or the countries being forced to reach a peace agreement. According to a poll conducted in Ukraine and 14 other European countries, over 55% of the respondents believe these to be the most two likely outcomes. For Ukrainian respondents in particular, 70% believe that Ukraine can win the war, so long as NATO keeps donating weapons. Most respondents also believe that the war will end either within the next year or within the next 5. What this means is that so long as Ukraine can get its hands on more NATO-provided weapons and defense systems, Zelensky might be able to push Putin to make a move that could cost him his seat on the throne, or even dismantle Russia as it exists today. But what do you think? Is there merit to Ukraine's plans to push into Russia, or will Russia find a way to win the war? Please let us know your thoughts in the comments section below, and thank you as always for watching. Now go and check out Ukraine is winning the war again, or click this other video instead.